Welcome, everyone. Delighted to see so many people here tonight. Many faces I know out there, a few new ones. So I'm Catherine Statler. I am the Collaborative Research Element Chair for the Humanities Center, and so I help oversee the Keck Fellowship. And I just want to say I am thrilled to be here tonight. To introduce, well, at least to welcome everyone and to hear our 7 presenters speak this evening. I just want to say first and foremost, I'm incredibly proud of the 7 of them. I've watched them all year as they got started on their projects and how the projects have developed and the research and the archival work and the trips they've done and the conferences they've presented at. And this is, of course, their culminating event right here to share their research with all of you. So I've had a chance to look at their drafts a couple times now, and I'm just incredibly impressed with the research. So I feel really, really good to be a part of this program that celebrates original research and that advances the interdisciplinary humanities, which is what all 7 of them are doing. So tonight we have an order set up, and we are going to have 4 presenters go this first half. So Erika, Yesika, Carly, and Patricia are going to be our first 4 presenters. We're going to have them present, each one's going to present, and then at the end of the 4 presentations, we'll have a Q&A period where the audience can ask questions. We'll do a brief break. And then we'll come back, we'll hear our additional 3 presenters, we'll do another Q&A, and then that will conclude the event for the evening. So that's our plan. And so at this time, I want to invite Erika to come up and get us started.
Thank you, Dr. Statler, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to the Humanities Center for giving us Keck Fellows this amazing space to share our work. So let's begin. My name is Erika, and I am a behavioral neuroscience major studying the sociology of medical knowledge through my project titled Medicine in the Pursuit of the Good, the True, and the Beautiful. I do so under the mentorship of my advisor, Dr. Thomas Reifer. And this is a public domain image of Hippocrates, who happens to be considered the father of Western medicine, and one of the authors of the Hippocratic Oath, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So to begin, in his work European Universalism, Immanuel Wallerstein, drawing on C.P. Snow's work, The Two Cultures, argues that modern intellectual life split the search for truth from the pursuit of the good and the beautiful, part of the cultural divide between the sciences and humanities. In the medical profession, graduating medical students recite the Hippocratic Oath, a vow that upholds ethical standards. It's best known for embodying the principle of do no harm, a commitment that reverberates good and beautiful acts. Medicine's usage of the oath seems to challenge Wallerstein's argument, aspiring a reintegration of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Interestingly, Wallerstein seldom referenced medicine's position in his proposed divide. My goal is not to identify medicine's position, rather untangle the implications behind medicine's ambiguity. So here's how we're doing. The U.S. performs poorly in translating healthcare spending into positive outcomes compared to other advanced capitalist nations, despite having the highest spending, $4.9 trillion to be exact. The U.S. falls below the OECD average in outcomes with lower life expectancies on the left graph and more deaths that could have been prevented on the right graph. All right. So my work is motivated to address the stark disparity between spending and outcomes by exploring medicine's unexamined role within the structures of knowledge by raising the following questions. First, what is the role of the Hippocratic Oath, if any, in guiding medical inquiry and practice? And second, how is the pursuit of truth related to the provisioning of healthcare in the US and around the world? All right, so this is what the rest of the presentation will look like. So we'll begin with theory. So I rely on Max Weber's analysis on rationalization, how different types of rationalities shape organization and action. Anthony Giddens untangles the 4 types of rationality. They are on display. This study focuses on these 2. Means and rationality has to do with carefully assessing the effectiveness of various means to achieve a specific end, opting for the most efficient means. Value rationality has to do with deeply held principles that guide action. Weber recognized a contradiction between means end and substantive rationality, the latter having to do with ultimate ends or values. If we are looking to carry out the most efficient means, what does that end ultimately mean? Means and rationality is short-sighted. It lacks substance. I ultimately argue that Western medicine prioritizes means and rational action and avoids the question of substantive rational action to its detriment. I do so using world systems analysis and comparative historical analysis. So let's talk about a mode of thought called scientific universalism that reflects the prioritization of means and rationality. So for centuries, the Catholic Church held a dominant position in shaping knowledge, but this authority was challenged when Enlightenment thinkers promoted empiricism. Scientific universalism refers to how objective rules govern all phenomena at all moments of time. It eventually became the dominant mode of thought by the 18th century and is still prioritized today. By Enlightenment, I mean the logical system, identified by Max Horkheimer and Theodore Adorno, that seeks to clarify the natural world. Its approach is totalitarian, insisting that the world must be calculable and utilitarian. So let's explore Paul Starr's comparative historical analysis on the professionalization of American medicine. The practice of healing became a profession not solely through scientific advancements, but through cultural authority. This authority contributed to the belief that the esoteric knowledge and practice of science justifies trust in doctors. Economic power, through the standardization of practice and licensing. And autonomy, preventing third parties from interfering the doctor-patient relationship. Althusser in Ideology and Ideological State say doctors act in such a way to claim that they must reproduce the logic of capitalism that is inclusive of means and rationality. We'll come back to that, but we need to address one more thing about the oath. The oath's promise is a minimalist guideline, as in it outlines prohibitions. Don't cause injury to your patients, rather than prescribing proactive measures of promoting human flourishing. So what's going on today? Why are we the only advanced capitalist nation, one of the only advanced capitalist nation, without a universal healthcare plan? In 1945, President Truman actually proposed such a plan. The American Medical Association denounced this plan as a threat to physician autonomy and labeled it as socialized medicine. This was a symbolic act during the Cold War period that ultimately derailed Truman's plans. These fears were unique to early American physicians, fears their brothers in England did not face. Truman's defeat helps explain why health insurance is dominated by the private sector, contributing to its rising costs. Physicians prioritize means and rationality by exploiting their cultural authority, focusing on their autonomy, and overlooking their ethical obligations, causing harm to the very individuals they vowed to serve. The emergence of a private market paradoxically contributed to the interference of today's doctor-patient relationships, precisely what the AMA aimed to prevent. One clear example is prior authorization, a requirement from your health plan to obtain their approval before providing healthcare or prescription drugs. Through this definition, health insurance in some aspects practice medicine like a doctor, but are not held ethically liable by the Hippocratic Oath. Libertarian economist Milton Friedman in 1999 said, "There is room for some public health activities to prevent contagion, keeping about half of current federal funds in the Department of Health and Human Services. In that respect, even some of the most libertarian thinkers believe the social provisioning of care is necessary for a sustainable economy, a feature that is ill-present in our current market." So prior authorization has burdened doctors and caused delays in necessary care. Moreover, today's doctors are ready to take action evidenced by a surge in enrollments for combined degree programs in medicine and public health. Despite the cultural authority of doctors, institutions beyond the walls of the clinic must be considered, like insurance and pharmaceutical companies, which is up next, both of which influence the provisioning of care in patients. COVID-19 is interesting because, unlike other pandemics, it affected everyone globally, regardless of your class and identity. In May 2020, the World Health Organization developed an initiative called CTAP, aimed to promote the sharing of COVID-19 technologies. This anticipated sharing did not happen. A year later, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres criticized the world for the inequitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Despite making up 18% of the world, Africa only received 2% of doses administered around the world, stating, "We passed the science tests, but are getting an F in ethics." Pharmaceutical companies are not just incentivized by profits, but are legally obligated to act in the best interest of their shareholders. So here are my takeaways. Our medical system was founded on antinomy between means end and substantive rationality that cannot be resolved. Physicians are not evil, rather exist in a capitalist world system which informs them how to view and treat their patients. That is to say, physicians were never sovereign. We make large investments to develop life-changing medication, and we get the least out of it, and a large chunk of the world can't benefit from it. The response, as seen in today's current political landscape, is to burn it all down. No, I am not saying we should abandon science or empiricism. Science is a tool to understand the world, and we can use it to do good and beautiful things. But it's worthy to note that the loud victories in STEM over the arts and humanities muffles efforts to address the relationships in pursuit of eudaimonia. Our healthcare system must be restructured based on a new vision of what is good, true, and beautiful. And to officially conclude, I'd like to acknowledge a few people, beginning with Dr. Reifer, my advisor, the Keck Fellows in the Humanities Center, the Menera Scholars Program, my family who's right there, and my partner, Leo. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Yesika Menera, and for the last 2 years, I've done research on how housing insecurities impacts women, and I've done this under the mentorship under Dr. Santiago. So before I begin, I'm going to want you guys, if you're comfortable, closing your eyes, and I'm going to kind of paint a picture for you guys. So imagine this. You're a single mother. Sorry, spoiler alert. You are in a married relationship, and you move across the country with your partner, and you leave your support systems back home. You eventually have kids, you have all the major assets, and you achieve that American dream. The car, the house, everything that the typical American dream is, you achieve that. But then eventually, you guys get divorced, but since your partner makes the more money in the relationship, they keep 51% custody of the children, they take the house, all the other major assets. The only thing you get to keep is 49% custody, and you get to keep your car. So what are you going to do on those days you have your kids? So you go to the shelter, and when you go to the shelter, they say, we can't put you on a priority list because you do not have majority custody of your children, but they can put you on a 5-year wait list, and that's the only way they can help you. Sadly, this is not just you guys can open your eyes, sorry. Sadly, this is just not an imaginable story. This is a true reality of what one person experienced. So imagine all the other stories that people have gone through. So ultimately, for the last 2 years, I've researched how housing insecurities impacts women, and do welfare services re-traumatize them, or do they truly help the women? How I did this is I gathered 26 participants, and we conducted interviews, kind of structured, around 15 questions or so, and then they had the option of filling out the DSM-5 PTSD questionnaire. And how I recruited these participants is through social media, flyers, at shelters, and then the snowball effect. So here's the flyer that I created, and as you can see, there's different qualifications for housing insecurities. Live in an overcrowded house, spending 30% of your income on your rent, couch surfing, homelessness, the list goes on and on. And then here's the PTSD DSM-5 questionnaire. And then let's see if I can get this to work. Nope. Okay. On the top right, as you can see, in the past month, how much were you bothered by? We changed that to, while being housing insecure, how much were you bothered by? And they had the option of filling this out. It was optional because it can be triggering, and so for that, it wasn't forced on them. So why is this important? 500,000 people in the U.S. are currently experiencing homelessness. The rate that homelessness is increasing so much, in 2050, just alone in California, that number will just be in California by 2050. That's around 18 out of every 10,000 people. 33% of homelessness reside in California, which is San Francisco, LA, and right here in San Diego. Next, 38.3% are women, and 7.7% million experiencing housing insecurities. And you might be wondering, what's the difference between homelessness and housing insecurities? Well, housing insecurities is a more broad perspective, and then there's these branches underneath, one of them being homelessness, 30% of your rent going to your income, living in a hotel, car, that list that I told you about earlier, those are all branches underneath housing insecurities. So now let's look into my results of what I found. Let's talk about demographics. First, we're going to talk about ethnicity and race. So as you can see, majority of my participants were people of color. And due to previous research, literature reviews, and then also my research, we can suggest homelessness and housing insecurities is a racialized issue. And I'm not saying white people don't experience race or housingness or house problems, but at the end of the day, it's more likely for a person of color than a white person to experience these issues. Next over here is age. As you can see, there's a big chunk right here, 18 to 29 years old. And that suggests because some parents might kick out their children at 18 years old. That happened to one of my participants, or maybe she got pregnant. Another way is if they're going to college and they can't afford college anymore and they have to survive throughout college. These are all qualifications under the 18 to 29-year-olds that we noticed. Education completed. This one's probably my favorite statistic because you can see majority of my participants did try and achieve higher education, yet still were homeless and housing insecure afterwards. And that kind of debunks that U.S. Stereotype that we have that homelessness barely get a middle school education or high school education. Yet we have one person here who achieved her JD and to this day is still homeless and living in her car with her 2 kids. So the impact of housing insecurities on these women. Number one factor is the cost of living. Kind of not surprised with this one. We live in California. We know how expensive it is, especially with most of these participants are single mothers. So child support, if they're paying that, it could be the mortgage, their car, all those bills that we pay. Now being a single mother and already trying to balance 2 to 3 jobs on average can be a lot. Next is some of these participants were children when they were housing insecure, suggesting a generational problem. How many participants experienced harm? As you can see, all 26 of my participants experienced some type of harm. Most all mental harm, some both mental and physical, but all 26 experienced mental harm. And these are common themes of what my participants were experiencing. The one I want to talk about is trapped, because when you're constantly in this cycle of trying to survive and housing, trying to find a job, et cetera, it's this consistently of being trapped and in this cycle of hard to get out of. Other ones, low self-esteem, depression, embarrassed, exhausted. So this leads me into homelessness is ultimately a traumatic event. Trauma results as an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual or physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects on the individual functioning of mental, physical, social, emotional, spiritual, and cultural well-being. Which ultimately research is suggesting that since homelessness is a traumatic event, to ultimately fix this issue, we ultimately need to fix or deal with the trauma before the homelessness, during homelessness, and then after homelessness, which then ties me into my PTSD scores that were optional to figure out, but the threshold is around 31. And as you can see, majority of my participants were over that threshold, and yet only one participant was mandated therapy and mental health help out of all my 26 participants. So now we're going to talk about welfare. These are the overall, kind of my table of contents, what we're going to dive into. But how many of my participants were satisfied with their safety measures? As you can see, 50% were satisfied, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about non-satisfied. So I'm going to kind of paint you guys a picture again. I had one participant who got Section 8 housing after a couple of years, which that was already a whole process of what she had to go through. But once she got this housing, it was getting paid for, and however, she had to pay the expense of safety. And it was in an unsafe neighborhood, and there was also a lot of crimes that were being committed in the apartment complex and also outside the apartment complex, such as, robberies, drug possession, and even other violent crimes. Another participant who was in an abusive relationship with her partner ended up leaving, and she called 211, which is a kind of nonprofit organization, and she ended up calling them. She had a newborn baby boy, and when she ended up calling them, she's like, I'm living in my car right now. Is there any way I can get a hotel voucher or some type of voucher just for the night because I plan on driving the next day? And I just breastfed, and I have this milk, and it can't go bad. And she was like pleading with them, and they just said, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. I can't just get a voucher. They said, I can assign you a safe parking lot that you can park in for the night. And ultimately, her milk went bad the next day. How many of these participants achieved permanent housing? As you can see, majority did not. And as I mentioned before, that 5-year wait list is average for most of my participants. I even heard up to 15 years for one shelter just to get a bed to stay in these shelters. So average is around 5 years, but it can get maxed up to 15 years just to get placement into these shelters. And that's why they're so overcrowded. And also, how many of them, another barrier for this, of how many achieving permanent housing, is because it's hard to deal with this welfare, also because of the staff members. As you can see, majority of them said no, they weren't respected. And I had one participant who was told, because you have nothing, you are nothing. Or she was told, victim blaming, you're the reason why you're in this shelter because you were in this abusive relationship. It's your fault that you're here, et cetera, et cetera. That typical victim blaming that we hear, that it was her fault, the reason why she's in the shelter. And other terms of, even verbal contact that has been used against these women. There's also really strict policies, depending on the shelters. I'm not bashing all shelters or anything like that, but these are just the stories I've had, that there's shelters that also have these policies, curfews, strict rules that these women have to abide by. So do they really have freedom in these shelters when they still have to deal with other stuff on top of being in the shelter? Welfare services address mental needs. As I already mentioned before, we know it's a public health issue. It's also a mental health issue when you're being homeless. And so as you can see, I had that one person that was mandated, but other people did agree that they did have the resources and they didn't reach out as much as they wish they could have. But there's still a good chunk that said no, that they did not get the mental health that they needed. Ultimately, the ultimate research question of how many participants were re-traumatized by welfare, as you can see, 88% said yes, they were, 1% said no, and that can be due to the previous reasons that I said. So these are all the welfare services that were accessed by my participants. The ones I'm going to talk about first is housing assistance, since it's a housing issue. And as you can see, did they truly help? That's what this column is. And as you can see, 64% said no, that these, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. That the housing assistance, such as Section 8, the motel vouchers, any type of housing assistance they could have gone, it truly didn't help them because they didn't really get the housing they needed. And then over here, re-traumatization rate. 100% said yes, it was re-traumatizing when dealing with housing assistance issue. So me personally, this column is the most important that I want to keep addressing after this. But next, on a positive note, is EBT. Majority of my participants did use EBT. It had an 86% successful rate and around 50-50-ish of a re-traumatizing rate. And this is probably one of the best statistics, EBT, overall. So if we can take what we learned from EBT and kind of apply it overall, these are the other ones. But my ultimate results is that majority of the women who are housing insecure do show severe potential PTSD symptoms. Welfare services, when all added up of the helps and did not helps, it is helping the women, but it's still at the expense of re-traumatizing them. And that's it. Graphically.
Hello, my name is Carly O'Rear, and I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Dr. Noble, my advisor on this project, and the Keck Fellowship Program and the Humanities Center. My project is titled Rethinking Authenticity in Shakespeare's Musical Comedies. On December 7th, 2024, I traveled to Cincinnati to see the Cincinnati Shakespeare Company's production of Twelfth Night. Accompanied by a fellow theater buff, one of my best friends from middle school, we sat front row excited for the show to begin. The production used a playful conceit, a merry band of players finding refuge in a warehouse, telling the story as resistance. Costumes came from a shared rack and chest. Sets were built from simple chairs and tables. Music was integral. Each actor picked up an instrument to join in several moments. It felt like spontaneous communal creation. With Twelfth Night leaning heavily on diegetic music, its first line even being, "If music be the food of love, play on," the effect was powerful. The music felt authentic to the world they created. Yet, no reviewer mentioned the music, either to praise or criticize. This omission is common in Shakespeare reception. Several major 2024-25 productions of Shakespeare's musical comedies, regardless of their musical choices, received scant musical commentary. Why is music the most consistently overlooked element in Shakespearean musical comedies? This neglect may stem from the cultural premium placed on textual fidelity, especially in word-perfect Shakespeare performance, which insists on strict adherence to the original wording and punctuation. A similar rigor exists in music. Historically informed performance practice, or HIP, uses period instruments, tunings, and techniques to emulate historical sound. Despite these parallel traditions, few contemporary Shakespeare productions blend word-perfect acting with HIP, creating a disciplinary siloing between theater and music and limiting holistic authenticity. I analyzed 3 productions: Cal Shakes's As You Like It, Mira Costa College's Much Ado About Nothing, and Cincinnati Shakespeare Festival's Twelfth Night, to highlight tensions when authenticity is unevenly applied to text and music. Drawing from Stephen Davies' aesthetics and Hans-Georg Gadamer's hermeneutics, I propose a more dynamic notion of authenticity that blends historical fidelity with imaginative reinterpretation, prioritizing the integrity of the production's artistic world. To understand the role of music in Shakespeare's comedies, we must view them in historical context. Queen Elizabeth I, a musician herself, presided over a court that valued music deeply. Music was ubiquitous in Elizabethan life and central to Shakespearean drama, serving not only to heighten the emotion and advance the plot, but also to solve practical staging problems, like signifying time passage or covering offstage action. Madrigals, a popular genre of the time, were often included in comedies, creating a commercial symbiosis. Plays promoted songs, and popular songs drew audiences to the plays, much like Tin Pan Alley in the 20th century. Music's ubiquity in these plays also suggests a personal connection between Shakespeare and composers. Historians believe Shakespeare knew Thomas Morley, a prominent madrigalist. Morley's instructional text may have inspired The Taming of the Shrews musical references, and he's believed to have composed O Mistress Mine and It Was a Lover in His Lass from Twelfth Night and As You Like It, respectively. Both songs appear in Morley's collections without the lyrics, and the two men attended the same parish, St. Helens Bishopsgate, at the same time. Even if not close, they were certainly aware of each other's work. Given this rich historical connection, the critical neglect of music in modern productions is surprising, especially since these same productions often emphasize historical authenticity in other areas. Shakespeare's enduring relevance rests on his position in the canon and the cultural desire to relive authentic historical experiences. But authenticity itself is a contested term. Shakespeare scholar Margaret Kidney argues that staging any choice reflects critical interpretation. Musicologist Peter Kivy notes that no single production can be historically authentic in every respect. Choices must be made. Theater and music disciplines each have their own standards for authenticity. In theater, word-perfect practice, or faithful preserving original text in punctuation, guides actors through Shakespeare's inherently musical language. Syntax, word choice, and even punctuation serve as performance cues akin to musical notation. Performers must scan lines to honor these rhythms. I have an example of scansion on the board here, a simple example of iambic pentameter, with the U's symbolizing unstressed syllables and the slash marks notating emphasized syllables, sorry. And I have an example of Judi Dench performing this monologue, so you can maybe hear it out loud.
The soliloquies we've looked at have a...
I left no ring with her. What means this lady? Fortune forbid. My outside have not charmed her. She made good view of me. Indeed, so much that sure methought her eyes had lost her tongue, for she did speak in starts distractedly.
This mirrors historically informed performance practice, which uses research and period techniques to approximate original performance conditions. While exact replication is impossible, Stephen Davies argues that authenticity in music means sustained engagement with the expressive priorities of the time. Hip, like word-perfect practice, aims to revive the aesthetic spirit of the original. So, oh wait, I have an example of this too. Here's an example of historically informed Elizabethan music. So, why are these approaches rarely combined? While some productions have merged the two, such as Santa Cruz's Taming of the Shrew that included a Baroque flutist, these collaborations are rare and also context-dependent. Academic and institutional siloing discourage interdisciplinary cooperation as well, especially within universities. As sociologist Richard Sennett has observed, specialization fragments our ability to collaborate meaningfully. Moreover, many scholars, such as musicologist Richard Taruskin, have critiqued the concept of authenticity itself. Taruskin argued in his article, The Spin Doctors of Early Music, that hip often imposes modern ideologies onto the past while claiming historical fidelity. He warned that supposedly authentic performances are modern creations shaped by present aesthetics, masquerading as historical artifacts. However, the study of hermeneutics offers a nuanced perspective on the concept of authenticity. Initially formatted by philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer and further expanded upon by ethnomusicologist Tim Rice, hermeneutics provides an interpretive framework for engaging cultural production. Drawing upon hermeneutical discourse to engage the concept of authenticity, Rice defines authenticity as a dialogue between cultural horizons. Musicologist Kyle Gann further develops Rice's theory of authenticity as seen through a hermeneutical lens. Gann suggests content over nature, i.e., what matters is not how perfectly a performance recreates the past, but whether it communicates the original artistic aims and the cultural world. Placing Gadamer, Rice, and Gann in dialogue with each other, we see the authenticity not as a fixed standard, but as a dynamic world building anchored in research yet open to reinterpretation. Two key elements define such authenticity: historical engagement and interpretive transparency. Historical engagement means sourcing period material, understanding musical practices, and integrating them into cohesive works. Though none of the three productions I studied used original scores, Twelfth Night and As You Like It effectively matched musical tone and diegetic emotional context. Their music suited their imagined Elizabethan settings and courtly norms. Interpretive transparency, meanwhile, acknowledges creative deviations while staying accountable to the source material's dramatic needs. Miracosta's Much Ado About Nothing reimagined the play in 1940s San Diego, with Beatrice as a suffragette and Benedict as a World War II sailor. While visually cohesive, its music, acoustic guitar folk tunes, felt anachronistic and disconnected from the rest of the world. Though aesthetically pleasing, the music undermined the production's otherwise immersive setting. This illustrates a broader challenge. Our understanding of authenticity is often either too rigid, idolizing replication, or too lax, disregarding historical context. A middle path, interdisciplinary collaboration between theater makers, musicians, and scholars, could deepen our productions and better integrate music as a vital storytelling tool. Ultimately, how we define authenticity reflects our values. It shapes how we relate to history, institutions, and collaborations. A living, inclusive approach to authenticity doesn't just preserve the past, it makes it meaningful today. Through analyzing these shows, which I'm very appreciative to have gotten to go travel to see myself through this fellowship program, I was able to engage with musical authenticity and uncover how sound shapes our experience of Shakespearean worlds. Rather than a forgotten thread, music emerged as a critical strand in the storytelling, one that, when woven with care and intention, enriches our connection to both Shakespeare and the possibilities of theater today. Thank you so much. Some acknowledgements. Dr. Noble, Humanities Center, Dr. Statler, Lindy. Thank you.
My name is Patricia Munoz, and my research project is titled The Nature of Metaphysics in Poetry. With mentorship from Dr. Crumley, I decided to focus on modern American English poet T.S. Eliot, who is famously known for a set of 4 poems, the 4 Quartets. Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1888 and died in London in 1965. His publication of the 4 Quartets contributed to his recognition as one of the greatest English poets. His poetic expertise was honorably recognized as he was awarded both the Nobel Prize for Literature and the Order of Merit in 1948. Each of the quartets is based on different memorable settings throughout Eliot's life. The first of the quartets, Burnt Norton, is set in a rose garden of a country house in Gloucestershire, England, that Eliot visited in 1934 with his wife, Emily Hale. The second quartet, East Coker, is named after a village in Somerset, England. Eliot traced the origin of his ancestry back to this location, hence its significance for Eliot. The third, the Dry Selvages, is a group of rocks on the coast of Gloucester, Massachusetts, which represents a town in which Eliot spent the summers as a boy with his parents. The last of the quartets is Little Gidding, a historic village of an Anglican religious community in Huntingdonshire, England. This quartet is particularly significant to Eliot because the community demonstrated an enduring presence of faith during the austerity of World War II. The name of each quartet holds personal meaning for Eliot, but the decision to call each poem a quartet was also an intentional choice. In music, a quartet is a composition consisting of 4 instruments, 4 vocalists, or a mixture of both performing together. Thus, a quartet is a piece of music specifically written for 4 instruments or voices. Eliot intended his quartets to parallel this idea. However, he differs in the way that each of his quartets consists of 5 sections rather than 4. Each quartet focuses on its own theme that weaves together to compose something reminiscent of a musical composition. Eliot's quartets are longer than most modernist poetry with much content to analyze. So for this reason, the focus of this analysis will exclusively be on the quartets Burnt Norton and the Dry Selvages. Eliot initially sets up the quartets with the overarching theme that all human beings face the struggle of mortality. Looking at Plato gives insight into his first quartet, Burnt Norton. In the symposium, Diotima's speech on the ladder of love focuses on the relation between love and beauty, suggesting that the real object of love is apprehending or recognizing the form of beauty. The speech suggests that the apprehension of beauty itself is the human analog of immortality. Additionally, in the symposium, Greek playwright Aristophanes introduces the idea that longing is a fundamental condition of being a finite, limited being. Diotima's speech agrees. Longing is the fundamental condition of our limited nature. Thus, Diotima's view reveals a cure. If we were able to recognize and possess beauty, then we could finally cope with mortality through our desires. By wanting to continuously have what is good, we wish to live longer to continue having good things, thus desiring immortality. We are able to see how Eliot uses his quartets to underscore the fact that we are mortal beings subject to decay due to the limitations of time. Various lines present examples of the coexistence of the past, present, and future. This coexistence explains that nothing is ever lost, including the past and everything that might have been if events were to have transpired differently. In Burnt Norton, Eliot writes that what might have been is an abstraction, remaining only a perpetual possibility, only in a world of speculation. Here, Eliot claims that past possibilities still remain present in the realm of our imagination. It is common to all human beings to wonder how their life could have gone if they had chosen another path. It is part of our human nature to speculate about the paths we did not take. Similarly, though events are finite, the past and future exist in the present moment through the mental activity of remembrance and anticipation. Although one might wonder how things could have been different and may even wish that they were, the reality that Eliot presents is that these ideas only can exist in a physically unattainable world of speculation. He says that what might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. The word point in this line is a pivotal word because the end is not a dead end, but rather a purposeful explanation of the arrival of the present, being the end. Although there may have been a time in which other options for directions of our lives could have been pursued, ultimately we find ourselves in the present due to the universal order of time. Eliot emphasizes that we are in a constant state of wishing and reminiscing. As mortals, we dread the state of struggle and instead want to stay forever in moments we find perfect. This, however, is unattainable since we face the reality of finitude. An early line in Burnt Norton states that if all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. The only reality that actually exists is the present moment, which contains infinite possibilities of new directions. The coexistence of the stages of time is meaningful because we constantly find ourselves bound by our temporal nature. The present moment appears to last forever, but in actuality, the present moment is in a constant state of flux. Thus, we are in a constant state of moving from past to future. Later, Eliot sets us in the scene of disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves, in which we suddenly find ourselves in the face of an unexpected item, being a bowl of dried petals, or in other words, flowers that used to bloom. Although they are now dead, the fragrance in their dried petal nature continues to linger, thus demonstrating that the past remains in the present. The connection between all aspects of time show that time is an illusion of separateness. Eliot's concern with human beings as essentially beings in time is seen elsewhere in his work. On a research trip to the Harvard archives to see various original Eliot writings, I came across a short play Eliot wrote, A Family Reunion. It tells of a family coming together after a long time apart, now reminiscing about their previous lives together and the freedom of their youth. Moving forward in their lives is painful and difficult for the family members because, as Eliot writes, everything is irrevocable, because the past is irremediable, because the future can only be built on real past. Throughout Eliot's works, he continues to discuss the idea that our temporal reality requires the coexistence of all aspects of time. Third of the quartets is The Dry Selvages, which focuses on the eternal nature of time and the interconnectedness of everything, including all aspects of time, as well as the sea, the land, animals, ourselves, and each other. The quartet opens with a discourse about gods and the immediate conclusion that the river in Gloucester is a strong brown god who has notable characteristics such as being patient to some degree, useful, trustworthy, as a conveyor of commerce. Although this river is described as a god, a status which should be highly honorable, following this praiseworthy description, the river is described to be forgotten. Eliot writes that the brown god is almost forgotten by the dwellers in the cities, a reminder of what men choose to forget, unhonored, unpropitiated, by worshippers of the machine, but waiting, watching, and waiting. The river waits to be acknowledged for its divine nature and significant influence it has on the way of life for the people in the city. However, the city dwellers live their lives as though the river does not exist, rather than attentively appreciating it. He writes that the river is within us, the sea is all about us. It's hints of earlier and other creation. This connection between the river and the notion of time indicates that the current state of the river once had a previous state. The river did not simply appear that day, but rather had existed for some time long before many of the current city dwellers came to live there, supplying essential resources for many generations before, and moving swiftly as it does now. The river has a past, and similar, we as people have a past too. We come from a line of ancestors before us, further showing that our present builds on the past. Throughout this quartet, Eliot often illustrates the interconnectedness of the natural world. However, I will present just 3 examples. First, the fog being in the fir trees, which demonstrates how the element of air resides in and is intertwined with the trees, an element of earth. Next, he writes that the sea howl and the sea yelp are different voices, often together heard. Although different voices are being spoken here, like a musical composition, the vocalizations of the sea howl and yelp are heard in concert. Third, the account between midnight and dawn, when the past is all deception, the future futureless. We can see that times in the day are operating as an illusion of separateness. In the way that the river and the sea are the same bodies of water that they were in their past, we as human beings parallel this idea, as we hold the same characteristics that make us the same individuals as we were in the past. Although different circumstances may be present, we carry some of the same traits into our future as we could have carried from a different pathway of our lives. Aspects of the world do not end in a way that stops existence, but rather alter themselves due to various changes that occur. Eliot writes that there is no end but addition, the trailing consequence of further days and hours, no end to the withering of withered flowers, to the movement of pain that is painless and motionless. To Eliot, time is not changing, but instead is a motionless existence that experiences addition to itself. Overall, Eliot is aiming to describe the eternal nature of time, even in the present moment, by looking at the interconnectedness of all aspects of the world. Aspects of metaphysics appear throughout Eliot's quartets in his depiction of time. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that inquires into the essence of various aspects of the world and ourselves. Essentially, metaphysics is a description of reality as a whole by offering insight into how things exist and how they are connected to each other. There are a range of views on the nature of metaphysics, but one philosopher that is particularly relevant to the study of Eliot's quartets is Alfred North Whitehead, who holds the view that a series of interconnected events make up basic units of reality. His view of metaphysics included scientific reasoning, art, morals, and religion to develop a new scientific ontology to further explain the kinds of things that exist while dealing with the nature of being. Central to Whitehead's metaphysical view is his revolt against the idea that the objective world of facts and the subjective world of values were divergent. Rather, he believes that they are harmonious in creating our human experience. Derived from this idea is the construction of his theory of feeling, which claims that our perception and experience grow together to develop our feeling, ultimately constituting our stream of existence. Together, these parts of our internal life are able to explain aspects of actual occurrences that we experience. In Whitehead's work, Process and Reality, he concluded by saying, actual entities are drops of experience, complex and interdependent. This means that reality as we perceive it derives from the process of advancement, including entities, which depend on the presence of their past, thus being interdependent. Objective content and subjective form rely on each other to provide the structure of consciousness, constituting the nature of our experience, which he calls feeling. In us, this often appears in our actual feelings and emotions, but everything, birds, rocks, the brown river, feels, in Whitehead's sense. This intensity and reliance on feeling serves to ultimately ground ontological explanation. Whitehead's metaphysical perspective connects to the four quartets in the way that the present relies on the past for its existence. Feeling fits into the idea presented in the Dry Salvages, being that the people described do not take their internal lives seriously enough, thus leading them to fail to notice the answers to their ontological mysteries. For example, recall the unnoticed god, the river. The unrecognition of its past demonstrates why the city dwellers feel pain. They feel that the past is irrevocable, when really the present is grounded in the past. Whitehead talks about feeling being the root of our experience and hence the basis for our explanation of the structure of the world. This metaphysical framework can help reveal certain aspects of the metaphysics of the quartets. The Brown River has been there for ages. On one hand, it is essential to people, but for Eliot, they have forgotten the history of their connection to the river, and so they lose the necessary feeling, the experience of recognizing our interconnectedness. For Whitehead, feeling is the felt reaction to the events around us. We experience things in this feeling matter. Eliot believes that we are connected to everything, that we have the wrong attitude towards the world, and that we need to change the way we experience the world around us. But because, as Whitehead states, we don't recognize our interconnectedness, especially between us and those things around us, we fail to feel the necessary connection, so our feelings, our felt reaction, and experience will be different than if we did. Eliot's poetry belongs in the modern tradition, but through it, he calls us to remember that the present always carries in it the past and future. As a result of my study, Eliot would agree with Whitehead's idea that expressing what you feel is essential to recognizing the presence of all aspects of time. Thank you.
Grace.
Hi.
I was just wondering, because I know you went to Boston to do some of your research, so I was wondering if you could just share like the experience of doing that in location and like on site.
Yeah, being in Boston was definitely a very special experience for me because as I was in Boston, specifically in the town of Gloucester, where Eliot based the Dry Salvages on, I was able to see the city in which he was describing in his poem. So I could see a couple of different things that he was referencing. Like throughout his poem, he would kind of refer to this bell that clangs. Like sometimes he would just say, the bell clangs, the bell clangs. And at first, the first time I read it, I thought this is kind of random. But as I was observing this river that he was talking about, I could see this, or I could hear the the church bell clanging, and it kind of made sense to me why he would include this, because in reality, like, it is kind of random, but it like fits into place. And so it was just interesting to see the ways that he was writing about like an actual place that exists.
Other questions? I have a mic. No pressure.
Okay. Hey, Yesika, I have a question about your study. So I know you were looking at a few different things through these case studies and for these specific people. I was wondering if you were going to continue this study or do it again. What would you add? What would you take away? Maybe like what things would you refine to get a better understanding?
Yes. So, okay, two things to your question. So first, I did a lot of when I gathered these participants, when I was interviewing them, it was all via Zoom. I am not a Zoom person at all. So if I could do it all over again, first, I did a couple in person and I love doing in person. So I would definitely do in-person interviews and making sure that process was much easier. And then to continue this research, something that is really sparking my interest right now is with the Olympics coming to LA soon, which 2028, I think, or 2030, whenever it's coming. LA has it's literally the capital. Skid Row is the capital of homelessness in America right now. And so with the Olympics coming out, seeing what they did in the other country when they moved all the homeless, they got rid of all the trash, they cleaned the river, yada, yada, yada. What are they going to do in LA? And that's honestly like a really high concern of mine right now. So I'm kind of I think the pathway I'm going to go down now towards is that with the Olympics coming to LA now, what is California, once Newsom going to do? What's going to happen? So I hope that answers your question.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I have a question for Carly, of course. So I was fascinated by your study. It's really, really well done. Congratulations. And I was just curious about your opinion, and feel free to be super opinionated. What is the worst Shakespeare adaptation you've ever seen? Whether it's a movie or a stage performance.
Oh, no.
There's so many bad ones to choose from. I'm just curious which.
What do I not like? Ooh. Well, I'm going to bar all of the bad high school productions of Shakespeare I've seen. I feel like those need their own category of... I'm going to speak about one I saw very recently that I actually kind of loved and hated at the same time. I was lucky enough to go to New York City this past January, and I saw the revival of Romeo and Juliet with Kit Connor and Rachel Zegler on Broadway, which was in part wonderful. I thought the performances were great, and the show itself had all this spectacle. I sat right next to Jane Krakowski, which was really cool, if any of you know who she is, so that was cool. But I hated the musical aspect of it, which really took me out of the world. And I think part of it was in trying to make Shakespeare more relevant and modern to a Gen Z audience, which the show was targeted at, they ended up maybe leaning into that aesthetic too harshly, potentially, where I think they took a bunch of like Gen Z buzzwords and like put them into a bowl and were like, let's put this one in this scene and, you know, everything. And then the musical choices, part of the whole big marketing of the show was that the music was going to be done by Jack Antonoff, who is a huge music producer, does all of Taylor Swift stuff, if you don't know who he is. But they also added, right before the act break, just a solo song for the actress playing Juliet to sing that had no connection to the prose or the aesthetic world of the story as it was in Shakespearean time, or even that connected strongly back to the world that they had created in that production. So I felt that very polarizing because I wanted to enjoy it so badly. And I did very much enjoy parts of it, but it was that kind of thing where it's like the musical aspects of it just don't quite match the aesthetics of everything else. And it pulled you out of the world of, you know, if you're going to build a Gen Z world that uses prosal language or poetic language, then I think it should maybe stick within the language. But yeah, I think that's my answer today. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Other questions we have? Yes.
Yeah, I have one for Erika. We're having all this argument in the country now about tariffs, but if you look at healthcare, there's a lot more money being wasted there or stolen, some people would say, you know, profiteering and so on. And it would seem like a golden opportunity to begin to talk about that more. Bring it up about how to reform healthcare. Do you have any?
Forgive me, I'm going to actually have to plead ignorance because I've actually never considered to blend what's going on with tariffs with respect to the state of medicine.
Not blending, it's like do instead of.
Gotcha. So the prioritization of tariffs over healthcare. Well, of course, I'm pretty bothered by that. Because ultimately, my passion project behind Medicine, the Pursuit of the Good, the True, and the Beautiful is to pursue eudaimonia, to pursue what is good and beautiful. And prioritizing tariffs, I just find that so silly because, I mean, based off the statistics alone, we're spending so much money on healthcare. Why must we reallocate? Why must we turn to tariffs as a form of saving when at the moment we have bigger fish to fry? And right now, the current state of healthcare is deeply troubled. Spending the most amount of money, some of the most amount of money around the world with some of the poorest outcomes. And I just find it silly that tariffs are kind of the big headline right now.
Well, maybe one way we could reprioritize. I wanted, because I was really curious about the prior authorization. It seems to me, hey, here's one way you could cut all this wasted effort and trying to get and money trying to get these authorizations and put more. I mean, there are many ways you could try to go about reforming, but I thought that was a really interesting point that you honed in on as one of your examples of how we are losing the beautiful and the good. I didn't know if you wanted to elaborate on that at all and where your research is taking you with that.
Yeah, so a lot of questions that I've been getting recently is what kind of policy should we propose that is good, that is true, that is beautiful, and carries out the least amount of harm? And I often hear the single payer system, and I'd have to even push for that as well, simply because right now the way our business models are set up, and again, forgive me for my ignorance because I imagine this is how it would work. But in the private market, we have so many different insurance companies in the private market with the vested interest to, first of all, protect their company through the incentivization of profits. And it's clearly unsustainable, hence the statistics. And with the single payer system, we have a larger reserve of money pooled together such that when, say, one emergency happens, we're able to pool from a larger pool of money. Whereas in much smaller insurance companies, if one emergency happens from one of the beneficiaries of one private insurance company, that puts that company at huge stake. So through a single payer system, I find that to be the most good, true, and beautiful approach. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Any last questions for our first group before? Do we have a question anywhere over there? No? Okay. So what we're going to do is I would like a huge round of applause. Very impressive. Thank you so much. We're going to take a super brief break, like 5 minutes. If you have to go to the bathroom, grab some more food real quick, and then we're going to have our next 3 presenters. So 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and do our next 3. Congrats, everyone. So well done. Okay, so we have our next 3 presenters. So Sydney, Grace, and Delaney are going to present next, and we're going to start off with Sydney.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sydney Rios Bruner. My faculty mentor is Dr. Darby Vickers of the Philosophy Department, and my thesis is titled De-Anthropomorphizing Intelligence, Rethinking Artificial Intelligence with Baruch Spinoza. So the main objective of my paper was to examine the potential for artificial intelligence consciousness using the philosophical framework of the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza. As we all know, artificial intelligence has rapidly become ubiquitous in daily life. This is due to the large rapid advancement period, colloquially known as an AI summer, that we are currently all in. In this period of rapid advancement and development, CEOs, techno-optimists, and even the general public frequently make claims that are largely exaggerated about the nature and state of AI. I've included some article titles on the screen that kind of highlight some of these claims. We see an article claiming that ChatGPT can actually outperform physicians when doing patient intake, a claim from a Google engineer himself that his chatbot he created was sentient, and finally a study that showed humans rated artificial intelligence responses to prompts of ethical questions and inquiries as more moral than other human beings. So I'm trying to point out here that this is highly problematic, but I want to know why these claims are occurring. At their core, large language models, which are a form of AI and the one we most commonly engage with, these are things like ChatGPT, are simply stochastic parrots, meaning they're highly adept at mimicking natural language production through sequential statistical prediction. However, there's no meaning or understanding behind the language they produce. If this is the case, if all that's going on here is sequential statistical prediction, why are we assuming these models are conscious? I believe this is due to flawed consciousness frameworks. The way we typically understand consciousness is as a binary. So an entity can either be considered conscious or not, with no degrees of consciousness in between. Conceptualize this as like a kind of on-off switch for consciousness. In this framework, typically only human beings are considered conscious. This view is so common that it has actually cemented itself within our language. All the language we have to discuss advanced intelligence and consciousness is highly anthropocentric. Consider words like think, know, or understand. These are all deeply tied to uniquely human phenomenological experiences, and it's impossible to divorce these meanings from those words. And in attempting to kind of highlight our lack of vocabulary, I want to briefly touch on the white noise metaphor. This metaphor was first introduced by 2 evolutionary biologists while they were trying to figure out what the origins of subjective experience and consciousness may phenomenologically feel like. To do this, they landed on the metaphor of white noise. We can all picture what hearing white noise is like. However, I'm trying to point out here how our vocabulary is failing us. We're turning to a completely different sensory experience to try and explain the origins of deep consciousness. So together, these flaws in our language and understanding consciousness as a binary creates huge fundamental problems when attempting to understand what's going on with artificial intelligence consciousness. Because the second an artificial intelligence model like ChatGPT can mimic markers of human consciousness like natural language production, there's an instant urge to anthropomorphize at this very first sign of complexity. In order to resolve some of these problems, I propose employing the philosophical framework of Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza is a panpsychist, which means he believes mentality is fundamental and ubiquitous within the natural world. So he thinks intelligence and consciousness itself exist on a broad spectrum, with being differentiated by types based on their complexity. We're going from the all or nothing situation of consciousness as binary to a wide spectrum. For Spinoza, consciousness is directly tied to embodiment. Drawing from work from Stephen Nadler, who's one of the most popular commentary on Spinoza, consciousness is the complexity of the mind that is the correlate of the complexity of the body. Importantly, this relationship is not causal. It's not that our embodiment is more complex and then it causes a more complex mind, but rather embodied complexity supervenes upon cognitive complexity. The best way I can exemplify this is think about our hands. These are highly articulate forms of embodiment. They're super complex. We can do a lot of interesting things with our hands. But in order to really use them to their full extent, we have to have a corresponding cognitive complexity. So, with this kind of foundational theory, our goal now is an evaluation of complexity in artificial intelligence. I will now argue that due to its computational paradigm, artificial intelligence fundamentally lacks complexity of living systems and thus cannot replicate the consciousness present in living systems. First, I want to start out with embodiment. Embodiment for artificial intelligence systems I'm taking to be as digital computers. Digital computers intentionally have a separation between hardware and software. This is so all Turing-complete digital computers can perform any kind of computational task. Think about it like this. You have your laptop, the physical hardware itself. On that laptop, you can run any program, browser, application, in comparison to something like a single-use computer that we would typically engage with, like a calculator that can only do one thing. So the separation between hardware and software allows us to do a wide variety of things, which is really great, but is also highly different from living systems. In this understanding, consider software as the symbolic component of the system, while the hardware is the physical component of the system. For living systems, our physical components and symbolic components are inherently intertwined. The best example of this is DNA. DNA is full of symbolic information, but that symbolic information only has meaning when it is directly translated into its physical instantiation. So during DNA replication, our DNA can only translate through producing a new nucleotide. Artificial intelligence cannot replicate anything like this. The separation of symbolic and physical components within the artificial intelligence system is a deep lack of organizational complexity within AI systems. This lack of organizational complexity prevents self-replication and evolution. Self-replication and evolution is deeply tied to the idea of autopoiesis, which states that living systems have an intrinsic ability to self-manufacture and we have an intrinsic drive to self-sustain. As I've shown, it takes an extremely high level of complexity to be able to self-replicate and self-manufacture. Your computer might be an extremely complicated piece of technology, but imagine how much more complex it would have to be to produce a little baby computer, or if it broke, to fix itself. That's an extremely high level of complexity that all living systems inherently have, that artificial intelligence is lacking. Moreover, this kind of complexity that we see in our behaviors provides us with autonomy from our environment. Because we have this intrinsic drive to self-sustain and self-manufacture, we have autonomy from our environment in order to achieve these goals. Artificial intelligence does not. Therefore, all living systems are far more complex than any current computational system we have. Even if artificial intelligence systems have a great amount of information, living systems have significantly greater organizational complexity and behavioral complexity. I want to expand on behavioral complexity a little bit more with speaking about artificial intelligence's situation within a small world. Artificial intelligence exists within a small world. In this world, there's not a lot of ambiguity. Problems are well defined, and AI has access to its world in its entirety. Living systems, on the other hand, exist in our physical reality, and this is an extremely large world. There's tons of ambiguity and contingency, problems are poorly defined, and we have to learn how to deal with these every day. So for living systems, our cognitive and behavioral adaptation and flexibility come from our ability to respond to feedback. We have to be able to understand how our past behavior impacted ourselves, our environment, and be able to modify it in the future to achieve our goals and ends. For humans, our multimodal embodied consciousness is highly complex. It allows us to take in all the aspects of a potential situation and be highly responsive to feedback and contingency within our large world. However, artificial intelligence systems, as we've shown, are simpler behavioral systems that can only deal with these extremely small world problems. AI is just less adept, less responsive, and less predictable at responding to feedback and contingency within its small world. This inability to respond to feedback and modify behavior leads to a worsening of behavior and cognitive complexity within an artificial intelligence system. I hope that everything I've gone through so far has reinforced the idea that's present in my thesis, that due to its computational paradigm, AI is fundamentally lacking the complexity present in living systems and thus cannot replicate the consciousness present in living systems. Before I conclude, I want to talk a little bit about why this is important and some potential future applications for this research. So we've already seen AI has a huge impact on the labor market, specifically looking at automation-prone jobs like introductory software design, introductory legal writing. A lot of base-level jobs that are writing heavy have already taken hits due to ChatGPT. This is relevant because I've shown you guys AI is not conscious. It can't do what a human being can do. So there are huge ethical implications that we are now letting AI perform all these human roles and tasks. Further, bias in artificial intelligence has become a huge problem. Artificial intelligence is trained on human data sets. So these are human pieces of writing, whether they be academic articles, news articles, or even just tweets on the internet. That's all integrated into AI training. Within these human pieces of writing, there's lots of implicit bias. AI is now internalizing these biases and reproducing them. So the figure I have on screen actually shows that when a LLM model, similar to something like ChatGPT, was prompted with African American vernacular English, it was more likely to rate the person providing the prompt as less intelligent, lazy, and stupid, which is obviously highly problematic. In order to combat this bias, we have to remember that AI is not conscious, it's not producing any new information, it's not acting like autonomously. This is all human biases and problems that we have to first fix before we can fully engage with AI. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Grace Moore, and I want to start by thanking the Keck Fellows Program for this research opportunity, as well as my advisor, Dr. Maura Giles Watson, for her guidance and support through this process. The title of my Keck project is The Musical Soundscapes of Heaven and Hell in Dante's The Divine Comedy. In addition to using structurally clear poetic organization in his allegorical tale, The Divine Comedy, Dante employs sound and music to create movement between heaven, paradiso, and hell, inferno, which profoundly resonates with the reader. Both music and anti-music emerge as literary devices that contribute to the poet's creation of a vivid atmosphere within the text. In this process, I analyze the literary effects of Dante's use of sound upon the pilgrim and the reader. Dante's use of sound creates potency within his work and seeks to create a more graspable literary world, thus increasing reader engagement and response with the text. I use this word potency to denote sound's provocative ability to make an impression upon a reader. So in this presentation, I'll be discussing some of the frameworks and approaches I use to investigate the text, including Dimmock's theory of resonance, Sanguinetti's anti-music, and Loria's music as contagion. Let's get into how these come into play. So Dante had a keen interest not only in his subject matter, but the reader's understanding of the world at the time. David Higgins with Oxford World Classics writes that it is precisely this aspect of Dante and his works, a concern to participate directly in the events of his time, formulate protest and register shock, that puts him in tune somewhat with our own times. In other words, Dante seeks to hold the reader's attention and interest by contextualizing his ideas within the time. One of his methods to accomplish this is sound. Sound, however, is not bound by time and historical context. It extends itself to us together in this room today. Yale professor Wei-Chi Dimmock suggests that in modern literary historicism, the meaning of a text is assumed to be the property of the historical period in which it originated. Coextensive with that period, a text remains undisturbed by anything beyond. She suggests that there is an innate lack of appreciation for how a text moves through time and changes with it, despite its singularity in its act of being born. A set of eyes and ears now may be better calibrated to consume certain aspects of text rather than others. The theory of resonance suggests that, rather than test if a text has enough strength to withstand years, we should instead experience it as it moves through time while remaining attentive to its meanings in the past. From a capacious cultural studies perspective, music is, like literature and visual art, a text, something woven together by human creative impulses. Along these lines, I argue that although Dante was writing for a medieval Florentine audience, as people of the 21st century, our attraction to his work remains strong within our own new and unique contexts. Sound, a human sense, gives people from all times a groundedness to connect to, thus making it a resonant and powerful textual device. Now let's get into some text. So the phrase anti-music was originally termed by Edoardo Sanguinetti, who noted Inferno's sonic elements are the antithesis of the celestial sounds that the pilgrim experiences later into his journey. In Inferno, the souls are suffering profoundly. Dante uses sound imagery to display the outward manifestations of the suffering. The sound he inserts informs the tone and attitude of the images the pilgrim sees around him. There is an innate connection between the senses, which creates an experience that can be lived off the page. The soul suffering in Inferno often manifests as sounds made by their body parts, vocalizations, wordless speech. I'm sorry, that changed. Sounds created by the landscape, and even an eerie lack of sound. In the 5th canto of Inferno, Dante encounters the souls which have been damned for committing the sin of lust. And now the painful notes began to fall upon my ears, for now I am come indeed to where great lamentation strikes me. And then later in the canto, when they arrive at the threshold of this ruin, there are cries, complaints, and lamentations, and there they blaspheme against divine power. Dante introduces the dolenti note, directly referring to the painful notes, as he is struck by this lamentation of the souls. Being struck has implications of an affective bodily response. There are 2 effects of sound, one affecting Dante the pilgrim, and another affecting us, the readers, who are meant to also enter this journey as pilgrims. As I noted earlier, Higgins relates to us that Dante wrote with an acute desire to make the reader feel and respond accordingly. Further strengthening this idea of the poet's design, Dante relates the cries, complaints, and lamentations, or anti-music, directly to their sin. Terming their oral utterances as blasphemous links anti-music to be in and of itself sinful. This connection presumes that these souls, through Dante's idea of contrapasso, are forever bound to suffer in this way. This implication gives the reader an understanding of anti-music as representative and associated with the atmosphere of Inferno. Sound is also used as a contagious way in Inferno. I'm going to read about that. And as the cranes go, chanting as they fly, stretched out in a long ribbon in the air, I saw the approaching shadows uttering cries. Dante is experiencing 2 sounds, the cranes and the souls of the lustful. The birds are chanting, which suggests a cyclical repetition of words unknown to the reader, who only knows that the sound is being produced polyphonically with the uttering cries. An utterance of a cry is an ambiguous label of sound. It could be presumed from this that the cries are not worded, but rather unknown vocalizations, similar to others found throughout Inferno. We see the effect on the pilgrim lines later. When I heard those souls in their suffering, I bowed my head and kept it bowed so long that at last the poet said, "What are you thinking?" The pilgrim is so moved by the sinner's suffering that he cannot help but have a physical reaction. In Federico Loria's scholarship on affective response, he relates that there's an aspect of what he calls social contagion at play. He likens this sort of social contagion with how one might feel gloomy when the weather is poor. I argue that Dante experiences a similar affective response to this suffering, which is being masterfully represented by the audible and arguably musical utterance of the soul. As readers, we see this response on the page and may feel ourselves moved to have a similar response, or at least one that functions on a similar axis. As discussed, Dante writes with the hope of moving our souls into spiritual action. Now let's shift gears and see how he's working in Paradiso. Okay. The music of the spheres refers to the sound produced by the rotation of celestial objects, planets, and moons. The sound referenced in Paradiso, Canto 1, is by nature of God. Dante uses these spheres as a storytelling device, which are laid out in these lines. When the heavenly movements which you render eternal, by their desire for you, took my attention, with the harmony that you regulate and distribute, so much of heaven then seemed to me on fire, with the sun's flames that ran and river near, made a lake spread out as widely as that. The newness of sound and the great light lit in me such a desire to know the cause of them, that I have never felt anything so sharply. Dante writes the Divine Comedy with a moral standard that the pilgrim seeks to live by, giving the text an added layer of educational value. Dante employs the music of the spheres as a tool to better reach and resonate with his readers in medieval Florence. While the belief in the sphere's efficacy was dying out, it would have been recognized and understood by its audience. In this, he also marks sound in Paradiso as divine and in contrast to the sound in Inferno, which is critical for the overall tonal shift of the text. Justice is also a big theme associated with Dante's Paradiso. For context, the pilgrim has made his way through hell and purgatory to enter heaven. While Dante insists that God is forgiving, he also is just and requires repentance for one's sins in order to enter and experience the glory of the kingdom. In Paradiso 20, the pilgrim comes face to face with an eagle who represents justice. The eagle, or the voice of the just, is producing the sound in this canto. The anatomy of the eagle is being used almost as an instrument would be played. Let's take a look at the text. And as the sound of the lute takes shape at the neck of the instrument, and as the wind entering the pipes does at the openings, so the interval of waiting over, that murmur rose out of the eagle, up through his neck as if it were empty. There it became a voice and issued forth from the beak in the shape of words, such as the heart on which I wrote them expected. So you can see how this eagle is being used sort of like an instrument would be played, with like the open throat, the hollow for the sound. Dante also does a third thing with music in Paradiso. He employs church music, something that would have been familiar to most readers of his time and to some now. In Paradiso 28, angels sing Sanctus, which is typically sung in a Gregorian chant style during the Mass. I'll read it in the text and then I'll play an example for you guys. Perpetually welcome spring with Hosanna, in three melodies which sound in those three orders of happiness in which it is woven. So the Hosanna is in reference. So if this doesn't work, you guys have to sing it, just so you know. Okay. Probably get the gist. Oh, now I have to figure out how to make this go in presentation mode. Oh, don't look at that, spoilers. Okay, let me actually read to you the translation because you didn't get to see it. Holy, 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 Lord God of hosts, heaven and earth are full of thy glory. Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. So it's very clear how different that would be than hearing cries and utterances in Inferno. Next. Okay. So for a medieval audience, the music of Paradiso would be familiar, while the soundscape of Inferno would have gone against common musical practices at the time. Dante marks these changes between Inferno and Paradiso, aiding the reader to feel the tonal shift. He's created a sort of film score to his epic tale, and I hope you guys have enjoyed learning about it as much as I have. This concludes my short time, but I'll leave you with a couple of modern iterations that both include sound. This one is an album of music based off of Inferno, and this is a limited series based off of Inferno, if you want to check it out. But thank you.
Hi, everyone. First, I want to say thank you for staying until the absolute bitter end here. I really appreciate it that I'm not speaking to an empty room right now. My name is Delaney Batter, and my project is called Symbol and Sovereignty, Propaganda, Power, and Medallions under Louis XIV. So, by the time of his death in 1715, Louis XIV, King of France, had transformed the French monarchy into a symbol of unrivaled power. His reign defined the age of absolutism, setting a precedent for divine right that echoed across Europe. The self-titled Sun King left a legacy of scientific progress and the golden age of art and literature, yet his political and financial decisions would send France into social instability that would eventually topple the monarchy. Solidifying King Louis's unprecedented level of complete authority across decades of political missteps and personal woes required a masterful use of public image and propagated ideology. King Louis's self-image extended beyond the standard use of iconography at the time and reached a new intersection of political ideology and visual representation. Focusing on propaganda and historical rewriting, King Louis employed artistic manufactories as a method of upholding bureaucratic authority across the French court. So, the French intellectual and artistic landscape of the 17th century was formed by the establishment of royal academies and consolidation of knowledge. Gathering writers, scholars, and artists all together under strict court guidelines allowed for careful crafting of historical and cultural narratives. Louis maximized this process to its fullest extent, as demonstrated by his transformation of the Petite Academy. Founded in 1633 by Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Petite Academy dedicated itself to promote the king's glory of a divine sovereign. Its primary function was the creation of medallions and their corresponding inscriptions to reinforce the image of Louis XIV. The Academy operated under strict royal guidelines, with King Louis often editing the publications himself. Under his continued support, the Academy went dramatic transformations, renamed the Academy the Inscription of Belles Lettres, representing and expanding intellectual missions, granting the institution funding and autonomy. The most significant project of Louis XIV's numismatic propaganda was these dual publications labeled as the Official Medallic History in 1702 and then in 1723, 8 years after his death. The Medallic History was presented in book form with an account of all the medals struck to commemorate Louis's reign, arranged in chronological order accompanied by explanatory text. These medals included references to diplomatic achievements, naval conquests, and personal triumphs. So, we're going to talk about the use of iconography for Louis's self as well as for the state. So, despite his short stature, standing at 5'3", in an unfortunate battle with premature hair loss in 1659, Louis's portraits radiated grandeur. His image was often fastened after mythological figures such as St. Louis, Hercules, Apollo, and the sun itself. As his youth declined, so did his portrayals of ageless deities, and new themes of paternalism and patriarchy were highlighted. So this is demonstrated by the Jean Warren Medal in 1674, which shows Louis as the sun shining down on the globe below him. It is also inscribed with the inscription non inferiorna secutis, which means not unequal to many, which followed Louis through the legacy of his reign. Another thing we have here is the phrasing of Ludovicus Magnus Rex, which essentially in his suit of armor refers to Louis the Great. This was the first time we actually see the words Louis the Great engraved, which then created an artistic legacy across all sort of mediums. In terms of iconography of states, we had figures representing provinces or countries were endowed with easily recognizable accessories, such as France given a shield or a dress, Mars and Hercules using to represent war, Apollo for the sun, Athena for war and wisdom, and justice appears holding scales and swords. So in the right corner here, we have an example of the capture of Nice, which is shown as a half-naked lady falling backwards. We know that this is Nice because of the mural crown of arms on her shield, as well as her laurel wreath, and it shows that she's been captured by France due to the standard in the background as the citadel being destroyed by bombs from the medal. So, Medallions served not only to enshrine Louis's image, but to celebrate the key events of his reign. Themes of personal rule, civil order, and military conquest permeated the medallic record. His martial accomplishments were no less emphasized than his personal, during which the War of Devolution, Louis brought artists along on his campaign to capture scenes of conquest for both contemporary acclaim and historical posterity. So, one such example is the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which was one of the most significant domestic events in his reign, also found its way into his history of metallic propaganda. Officials' medals issued by the Petit Academy boasted inscriptions such as "True Religion Victorious," "Hearsay Extinguished," and "The Temples of the Calvinists Destroyed." Likewise, the Medal of the Siege of Douai showed Louis in the trench, which was very unlikely at the time for a king to be in the trenches, and its description alluded to his role in the campaign, saying "Rex du Etemils," the king as a leader and a soldier. Not that a 5'3" soldier was going to get as far, but when Louis's victories became scarce, his propagandists sought to manufacture triumphs or exaggerate minor successes. So an alternate way to look at this is through the timeline. When we see smaller events becoming commemorated, we can maybe read between the lines to see that there was current, like, contemporary issues going on in France. So, for example, his second half of his reign was marked by military failures, domestic strain, and widespread dissent among people. The reality was that he had increased strain on financial coffers, and the War of the Spanish Succession was a grueling conflict that lasted 12 years, and we can see this by only 24 medals coming out of this period. So to overcome this, they started celebrating, like, very minor events such as his recovery from fistule surgery, which they found a need to put on a medal, as well as a completely made-up visit to the academy, saying the king, aware of the usefulness that could benefit his kingdom, established a company. His Majesty showered them with benefits, regulated the number, time, and place of their meetings, and gave them all necessary assistance. So here we see a really apt example of them highlighting his benefits and his benevolence as a way to sort of allow a historical legacy to be crafted to suppress struggle and highlight grandeur. So, the construction of his official memory also necessitated the suppression of inconvenient events. One such example was the destruction of Heidelberg by French troops during the 9 Years' War, an action that was originally celebrated at the time with a medal, but later suppressed from the official record due to its barbarity. This, as well as the atrocity of the destruction of the Palatinate by the French troops, which these are actually the two first examples of modern atrocity propaganda. So here we see the popular inscription of, this is the first of the Heidelberg medal, the Ludovicus Magnus Rex, as well as them looting and taking with skeletons crawling out of Heidelberg, later erased from public record. So, by shaping what was remembered and what was forgotten, the medallic history of Louis XIV reveals itself not simply as a chronicle, but a deliberate fabrication of a political fantasy rendered in metal. One strong way we can see the impact of these medallions, even 4 centuries later, was through the use of counter-reliefs. As stated by head of former British Museum Mark Jones, for a parody to be possible, the original must be available, and for it to be effective, the original must be widely known. So, for these counter-reliefs, they're satirical or subversive metal created by dissenters, often abroad, which mocked or contradicted the royal narrative. These unauthorized objects co-opted the medium's conventions while reversing their meaning. So many of the very same events touted by the French were then made as slanderous mockery by the Dutch or the Germans. So, for example, we have the 1709 medal, Colossus of Rhodes, which shows Louis as the Colossus of Rhodes crumbling under his own weight, celebrating the 1709 capture of Hainault from the French, and represents the impending end of Louis's preeminence. To its right, we have the humiliation of Louis XIV, which just depicts an explosion decorated with a fleur-de-lis, which is the common symbol of France, and the description demonstrating France's self-implosion. Below, we have the reverse of the medal and the front side of the medal showing Louis in rags with smoke and explosion behind him, and then we have the brave and heroic William the Liberator is what they referred to him as. So dissenters often drew attention to subjects that were taboo in official discourses, such as king's mistresses, king's ambition, lack of morals, tyranny, lack of religion, and intellectual inferiority, which allows a really unique nature of something rarely seen in other art forms, which is the ability to be adopted and transformed into an artistic process. So, to conclude, the medallic history of Louis XIV stands as one of the most sophisticated campaigns of political propaganda in early modern European history, one that blurred the boundaries between historical documentation, myth-making, and authoritarian image control. Far from serving as neutral commemorative effects, these medallions crafted a curated memory of Louis's reign, celebrating imagined victories, suppressing inconvenient truths. At the same time, the very visibility of these medallions and recognizability allowed them to become vehicles for dissents and opposing parties. Through these counter-beliefs and their subversive adaptations, critics reappropriated the king's own tools of the glorification to expose his flaws. So through these case studies, among many others, my research seeks to contribute to the scholarship on the methods of ideological dissemination that are of great historical importance, yet often overlooked in current art historical canons. Thank you.
I'd like to invite questions from the audience. So don't be shy. I'll bring the mic to you so everyone can hear you.
I have a question for Grace. I was wondering, why do you believe that Dante plays such an emphasis on sound rather than a different sense?
Okay, actually, I'm just gonna do this. Oh, that's heavy. Thank you for the question, Maris. So there are some scholars who talk about Dante's experience with sight and hearing, and there's a possibility he had impaired sight at one point in his life. He had like an event that impaired his sight. So it kind of makes sense that there'd be an emphasis on sound in his writing. But also in Inferno, there's a sort of spiritual blindness at play because the souls that are in Inferno are in a state of sin, which is their spiritual blindness. So for the pilgrim who is traveling through Inferno, it might be easier for them to be responsive to sound because of the spiritual blindness that's happening, if that makes sense. But thank you for the question.
I think we had a question over here.
Hi, thank you all. This is really good and really enjoyable to engage with. So I have a question about, which is sort of an edge case and may not be something that you know the answer to, about the iconography in Louis XIV's coins. So one of the things that I noticed is the like proliferation of classical imagery, particularly in the way that he is like styling himself, like even in the, Academy sort of coin, the sort of fabricated coin. We have the Apollo Palatinus at the top, and we have this real classical imagery. And then with the collapsing of the Statue of Rhodes, we once again go back to this classical imagery. So I'm curious as to, one, the sort of potential like pagan undercurrents, especially of that very first coin that you showed about him as the sun. And then also about like the way that the ideology would have been disseminated to the audience. Is the expectation that people who would be paying with these coins would have the kind of classical understanding to be able to pull this out of the iconography on the coins themselves? Or are these high enough denominations that like no peasant is going to be paying with them, and that's why this iconography is so successful? Just wanted to know a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's like a really important consideration because so at this time, the classical allegories that he is referencing would have only really been assuredly understood by wealthier, higher up members of society. And this was important to him because he wanted to make sure it was seen by the right people. And in his mind, I don't think that included the lower classes or the peasants. He wanted them to be disseminated in Switzerland, in England, among other high-ranking people, other royalty, other members of nobility. So the kind of allegorical classical figures would have been systematically and directly influenced by what they would know. And then interestingly, we do see a decline kind of towards the end of the 1690s from classical imagery because all of Europe at that time was going through a shift away from classical allegory and into more modern themes, which is where you start to see more of a take of paternalism and patriarchy more so than Apollo.
Other questions?
Hi, I have a question for Sydney. I'm really curious about your use of the term techno-optimism and what exactly that means, because I'm sort of a recovering digital humanist, and it just seems as though we're at a point with the internet just becoming a vast dumpster of misinformation and AI interfering with so much of what we try to do now with even basic programs like PowerPoint and Microsoft Word. It steps in and tries to redo what we're doing, whether we want it to or not. And I'm wondering what is the sort of state of techno-optimism now, because maybe it's personal for me. I've just lost mine. So.
No, I think that's a great question. And I think speaking towards techno-optimism centered on AI, I think one thing we really see, it's the undercurrent that we think overall artificial intelligence is beneficial and it can help us in any shape, form that we potentially want it to. I think one of the most potent ways, like I see it as a student, is the idea that artificial intelligence is actually helping, not hindering, in education. So the idea of like AI tutors expanding access to education for people who potentially can't afford like a tutor themselves, like perhaps that's a way we can educate a greater amount of the public. And this idea that there are fundamentally good uses for technology if we can figure out how to use that technology properly. Not saying that I agree necessarily with techno-optimism, but typically those are the claims that they're pushing forth, that AI is conscious and this is a good thing.
Other questions for our yes?
I also have a question for Sydney, so you can just grab the microphone again. So sorry. I think that when you're studying something like artificial intelligence, like at a time like this, it's constantly advancing and evolving. And so I was just curious if you could do your project again, like today, is there any other direction that you kind of were interested in taking it in that you didn't get to because of like time constraints and things like that?
Totally. I feel like I could have worked on this for years on end and never come to like a really solid conclusion, because I think there's two things kind of going on. Like AI is obviously like a very rapidly moving target. And I think I would have loved to potentially okay, so entering into this, I didn't know anything about AI actually. Like a year ago, I couldn't have told you what a large language model was. So kind of entering in this, I had like a certain hubris of like, I'm going to connect this great philosopher from modern philosophy to artificial intelligence, and I'm going to do it all in a year. I think maybe I would have focused a little more just on artificial intelligence, as much as I do love Spinoza. But I think also something complicated about this is like, our understanding of consciousness is a moving target. So I think if I had transitioned away from Spinoza, then I would have had to deal with, well, how am I going to define consciousness now? So I think maybe scaling down, but I think it was really rewarding. So
actually, I feel a lot better about after listening to your presentation and living systems and the issue of behavior. I'm feeling better about human beings, honestly. So thank you for that. I thought you did a great job. Other questions? Yes.
Not to bring back the scary thoughts, but I have another question for Sydney. I've heard of people talking about small world systems and large world systems existing within the brain. So that kind of makes me think, well, first, if we could kind of recreate the physical complexity of the human nervous system with AI, that would work that way. Do you think AI would then have the potential for consciousness if it were complex enough? And second, kind of the reverse of anthropomorphizing AI, but applying these algorithmic concepts to describe the brain and neuroscience. Do you think it's wrong to do that? Do you think we need a new framework to understand consciousness?
Totally. I think both of these questions kind of speak to pan-computationalism, which is this notion that everything like within our physical reality, every living system and so on, can be understood as a type of advanced computation. So the consequence of this is that then there is the potential for us to recreate all types of living systems, our physical reality, laws of physics within a artificial intelligence agent or some type of algorithm, some type of computational system. So to me and to Jaeger, which is a philosopher who I cite a lot in my work, this is the product of like an equivalence fallacy, because the notion that everything is a computation comes from the idea that we can simulate a lot of physical reality within artificial intelligence systems. And while we can simulate it, that simulation is not equivalent to actually what's going on in our physical reality. Like, we're all governed by the laws of physics and our external world. And just because we can simulate that does not mean that's the same thing of that thing actually occurring, if that makes sense. So I think there is a danger in trying to equate artificial intelligence to the human brain. I think it can tell us a lot of interesting things about it, especially when we look to like neural networks and how those function. But I think too close to relating them kind of carries us back to this concerning path.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. My question is for Grace. Hi, Grace. I loved your presentation. And I love the notion of soundscapes and of anti-music. That was a new term for me. But I wonder what you think is the significance of Dante's avoidance of real music in Hell, and then the explosion of allusions to real music, song and so on, instrumentation. I mean, in Purgatorio and Paradiso. I mean, it's not like there aren't references to instruments and stuff in Inferno. Like, I think of the demon that he says made a trumpet of his asshole, for example. Yes. A great line. And I would have said that there's no, actual songs referenced in Inferno at all, but it's not true. In 34, Virgil quotes the Latin hymn Vexilla Regis Prodeunt Caeli, but he replaces the Caeli with Inferni, right? So the banners of the King of Heaven go forth, but it's a Latin Christian hymn. So there is actually a reference to one song in Inferno, but it's made an anti-song, right? Yeah, so it's interesting. But what do you think is the significance of that Dante doesn't use bad music in Inferno, but tends to only use anti-music, sort of avoid music for other kinds of sounds in that soundscape, and then shifts to the use of actual music later in the poem?
We actually take it out this time. That's a great question. Thank you, Dr. Nevitt. I think Dante, like as I spoke about, Dante is writing this with the intention to like move the reader's soul into spiritual action. So he wants us to be afraid when we're in Inferno. He wants us to be uncomfortable, especially because he's writing for a medieval Florentine audience. Like, he doesn't know us yet. He doesn't know we're still going to be reading this huge book in college for pleasure. But he did know that the people of his time would read it, and he knew that these people would not recognize these things as music. They would be things that we would recognize, the sounds that I reference. Like, we hear these in media all the time, horror movies. That's when I kind of connect theory of resonance. Like, that's significant to us in a different way than it would be someone in medieval Florence. So I can't speak for Dante and tell you exactly what he thought with this, but I can tell you that it's an essence of horror that I think he's putting into this, kind of maybe scaring us away from committing these sins that he's kind of showing us are like, you will suffer in this way, which is like related to Contrapasso, which I talked about. And then as for the song that's referred to with the trumpets, which of course is like the end times are coming, and then out of his anus is crazy, but he had to be a little funny. It's a Divine Comedy. I think yes, it's a reference to a song, but the song is changed to become something that is not musical in the way that his audience then would have seen it. And then we have this beautiful music in Paradiso that you got to hear some of, that would have been familiar to anyone, and is familiar to probably a lot of people in the audience, or not, which is also cool. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Grace. That I see sound everywhere, or I hear it everywhere. It's every every line now, even the parts you haven't highlighted, I'm like, wait, there's sound here. And there's sound. So now I'll never be able to read it the same way again, which I think is no, I like it. I had a question for Delaney. I was super interested about this idea of Louis XIV as the new Apollo, and how he presented that image, and then how it shifts as he gets older, things fall apart, to this more paternalistic look. And was there a specific coin where you saw that, or medallion, where you saw that change, or is it a sort of gradual? I was just so curious.
Yeah, it also comes across in portraiture of him as well. There's like a distinct shift, I think, around the turn of the 16th or the 17th century into the 18th century, where there's one very unflattering coin of him. And I think after that, he said, no more. We're going to shift this, because it does show his marks of aging and hair loss and unfortunate gout. Which never helps anything or anyone. So no, it is very interesting that after that, when I think it became a bit far-fetched to try to portray him as some strong, heroic figure, that the ideological aspect took precedence. And then that's where we see themes of patriarchy, paternalism, all of that, because it was the ideological underpinning that still was the most important to him.
That's so interesting. Thank you. We are, I'm trying to close on time here. So here's what I propose. First of all, I propose another round of applause. And then second, I want to propose another round of applause for all seven. And I just want to say, I thought those presentations were so professional, so well done. It's just absolutely amazing. And it's so exciting to hear where your research has taken you, all the new examples you've brought in, and the conclusions that you're reaching at the end of the academic year. So could not be more thrilled for all of you. What a wonderful program. What a wonderful tribute to the humanities. And I want to thank all of you for attending. Very much appreciated. And I want to encourage you, if you have additional questions, to please seek out our panelists if you would like to ask another question. And on that note, I'd like to conclude the evening. Thanks again.